All right, welcome back. I'm currently looking at Chapter 7, which is the American Revolution, the Road to Independence. Now, there's a couple of things that you want to make sure that while reading through this that you take note on, and those are expressed in the essential questions. Now, those essential questions are: how did the French and Indian War make the colonies ripe for change? Which British policies in the colonies led to disagreement? How did colonial protests against British policies escalate to an armed conflict? And how did the individual leaders influence the course and outcome of the revolution? Now, there are specific things in here. French-Indian War, for example, the Proclamation Line of 1763, the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Intolerable Acts, Valley Forge, Battle of Saratoga, Battle of Yorktown, Unalienable Rights, the Declaration of Independence. These are all things that we need to make sure that while reading through this chapter, we are very well versed in understanding what they are and how they played a key impact into the road to independence. Now, getting started, we're going to start off with the French and Indian War. Now, back at the time of 1750s, the British controlled much of the Ohio River Valley just across the applications from the British colonies. Meanwhile, the French had built forts along the Great Lakes. They also claimed control of the Ohio River Valley southwest of their settlements. So there's a little bit of push and shove from your British and your French. Now, these conflicts that broke out, essentially what ended up happening was it was Britain versus France, and France ended up requesting the aid of a couple of Indian tribes to help them fight the British. What this ended up becoming known as is the French and Indian War. French military bases were located in Quebec and Montreal, while the British had bases along the Hudson River Valley. The area between them became the main battleground. In 1756, the war spread from North America all the way back to Europe. Now, as you can tell, if it spreads from North America to Europe, that means that they're battling across different vast regions. Now, the key importance of that is they're basically battling on two fronts. They're battling on the North American front as well as back in Europe. So you're having to take care of two different sides to that story, which is going to cost you a lot of change, a lot of money. Now, what was the main cause of the French and Indian War? What was it that they were fighting over? And what were the main effects of the British victory in the French and Indian War? So how did the British coming out on top influence and impact what was to take place in North America? Causes of the American Revolution. In 1763, North America was at peace. However, 12 years later, the colonists would be at war again. To understand the underlying causes of this new conflict, it is important to remember that the colonists had inherited rights of free-born Englishmen from the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights. In America, the colonists had also developed their own representative assemblies, such as the House of Burgesses and the General Court of Massachusetts. By 1763, the colonists were already aware of the large degree of self-government. After the British victory, the colonists felt safer and less in need of British protection without the French threat along their borders. At the same time, the colonists became involved in a new series of disputes with the British government. So now, what's taking place is your colonists are no longer having to worry necessarily about the French being on the back door, so to speak, of the colonies. They're not necessarily having to break out in conflicts for disputes of land. Things are kind of turning back into this series of peace. Now, because of that, your colonists are now focusing their sights the other way, which is towards Britain. Now, your colonists have gained rights from these specific things, such as your English Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. They've gained rights from these specific pieces of information or specific events, and they have become well aware of the fact that they are able to have a voice. Now, what ends up happening is, with the voice that they now have, they are attempting to use it, and it's not necessarily going well. Now, the Proclamation Line of 1763. So, thinking back to the French and Indian War, well, we ended up having to take care of the French, which we did, and they kind of backed out just a tad bit, enough to where we weren't having to fight them consistently. However, we still had to deal with the Indians. Now, the Proclamation Line of 1763 was the first of the disputes concerning the opening to the West. Following the victory in the French and Indian War, many colonists had hoped to move out to those new lands. Many had wanted to go out and explore and make the kind of gold gain, maybe a religious gain. For whatever reason, they wanted to move out west, and it was basically, no, you can't. For whatever reason, they were wanting to go out west. They could not, and it was mainly due to the Indian concern, because if we start moving out west again, it's going to spark those Indian attacks, and the British at the time are not wanting necessarily to put a whole lot of money into it to really take care of that situation. And so the next best thing to do is, well, keep the colonists from going out, keep the settlers from going out into those lands, which is allowing them to put a stop to the dispute, but also keep a control on your colonists and where they are. Now, the types of people that were wanting to go west are those who saw it as an economic, religious kind of thing, but you also had people who were wanting their children to go out and make something of themselves. So they were wanting to save up money to push their children out so that they too could make an opportunity in those new lands. Now, King George III issued a royal proclamation to prevent further Indian attacks. The king declared that the colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was greatly resented by those colonists who had hoped to settle on the new western lands. So, although it seemed like a good idea on the British side to make this Proclamation Line of 1763, which stated that colonists could not move west past the Appalachian Mountains, it was greatly resented by the colonists. They did not like it. And this is one of those moments when, with the idea of their government and the free rights that they've gained from the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights, they're wanting to voice their opinion on it. And so they will. What comes next is the Sugar Act and mercantilism. Another source of conflict arose when, to enforce their mercantilist policies, the British government passed the Sugar Act in 1763. This act reduced an imported sugar in half, but also took steps to enforce it more strictly. So what ends up happening is the British are bringing in sugar to sell for half the cost. So they're making the ability to make money on their own goods. But who does it hurt? Well, it hurts those who are making it domestically, at home. So your colonists who are making sugar at home aren't necessarily being able to do so. Now, Samuel Adams, who is a journalist and politician in Boston, organized protests against the Sugar Act, which was repealed in 1763. So once again, these colonists who have gained rights of freeborn Englishmen are voicing their opinions. They're fighting things in court, and they're really stretching their muscles, so to speak, with their new rights. Now, with the Sugar Act, essentially what it was is it was an issue of taxation, and it was mainly because of the fact that they weren't like given a notice. They weren't given a heads up of, hey, would you or would you not like the idea of this taxation? And with that, and what you will see from various other taxes, the colonists do not like when they are not represented in government. Now, disagreements quickly rose over the British Parliament to tax the colonists. After the French and Indian War, Britain faced a huge national debt. It also cost money to station British troops in the 13 colonies and the West Indies. In Britain, people already paid higher taxes than the colonists. The British government therefore proposed a series of new taxes on the colonists. However, these taxes were passed by the British Parliament without first consulting the colonists. British leaders thought that this was only because the colonists were not paying their fair share towards their own defense. Since the colonists lived so far away from London, it seemed impossible for them to participate effectively in the British Parliament. Now, on one hand, Britain is at a lack of money because of the French and Indian War. So what do you do? What do you do to make money? Well, you raise taxes on your home front, which is back in London, and they were paying greater taxes than what the colonists were. Now, what ends up happening is the colonists are therefore taxed at a way that is to make up more money. The problem with that is they were taxed without their consent. They were not given the right to disagree, supposedly, with this new tax, and because of that, it really upset a lot of the colonists. Now, taxation without representation. Wealthy colonial merchants and landowners, used to acting in their colonial assemblies with little British interference, resented the new policies. They were also influenced by the Enlightenment writers like John Locke and William Blackstone. Locke had written that the government was a social contract. He said the purpose of government was to protect individual freedom and property. If a government failed to do this, Locke argued that its citizens had the right to overthrow it. Blackstone defined the rights of individuals in English law, as well as the property rights that could not be violated even by the king. So now, not only are you having people who are wanting to step up and speak out against it, you're also having these quote-unquote Enlightenment writers who are basically trying to open the eyes of the people to say that, hey, you have a voice, you need to use it. Don't allow someone or something to take away the rights that you have. Now, following both Locke and English traditions, Samuel Adams and other colonists argued that the British government should not tax the colonists without their consent. These colonists believed that taxation without representation was tyranny. Tyranny is a term that is used for a leader who has lost his way and is becoming more and more of a rude tyrant, which is a rude person who's wanting to control things in a negative way. It's not someone who's very favorable and not really liked by their people. The Stamp Act. The next new British tax was the Stamp Act in 1765. So we have the Sugar Act, now we're having the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax on any paper, pamphlet, or other public or legal document that had to be written or printed on paper with an official stamp or seal on it. So anything that was going through paper, newspaper, anything like that, was going to be placed with a tax on it, which was a stamp. Not necessarily a major thing that they were very upset about, but it was the idea of, once again, you guessed it, no consent. They weren't represented, they had no idea to fight against it, and so it's just done, and they had no say. And that's what really upset them. It wasn't necessarily the actual Stamp Act, it was just more or less the idea of being taxed without the representation. Now, of course, you can guess, well, the colonists ended up boycotting it, which is just refusing to buy these goods. And Patrick Henry denounced the Stamp Act, and the House of Burgesses passed resolutions against it. Samuel Adams organized a series of protests in Boston. A Stamp Act Congress against the act was held in New York City. Colonists produced petitions to the king and parliament saying that their position on the new taxes. These petitions argued that the colonists would not only be taxed by their own consent. And what ends up happening is a British tax collector is tied to a pole by an unruly crowd. So not only are they voicing their opinions, but it's starting to become somewhat out of hand. Your people of the colonies are getting so upset that they are doing public displays of unrest with the tax. And so back at the time, anyone, for example, that was a British tax collector was not necessarily seen in good public standings. Now, to finish this little statement off, this part 1, I'm going to finish off with the opposition grows. Now, in response to colonial protests, the British repealed the Stamp Act, but now introduced the Townshend Acts. So we have the Sugar Act, then we have a Stamp Act, and now the Townshend Acts. These acts impose duties, which are special taxes on goods used in the colonies, including glass and lead. Again, Parliament passed these taxes without consulting representatives in the colonies. And once again, many colonists bitterly protested against these new taxes. So again, third time's a charm? Not necessarily, because they're still being taxed without their representation. They held rallies and organized into groups like the Sons of Liberty. To influence public opinion, they circulated pamphlets, newspapers, and political cartoons criticizing the new taxes. Yet even in the crisis, most members of the Sons of Liberty remained loyal to King George. So it's kind of interesting that although you are wanting to petition and speak out against the king, because you have that right, you're still going to remain loyal to the king. So kind of a double-edged sword, so to say. Now, they remained confident that the British Parliament would eventually repeal the new taxes. So they're staying loyal because they believe that British Parliament will do the quote-unquote right thing. Okay. Now, we will read about the Boston Massacre and the Tea Duty and the Boston Tea Party. And we will eventually lead into the Intolerable Acts. Now, those few things that we just talked about are the road to independence. So when I come back, what we will do is we will finish up this chapter, hopefully. It's kind of a long one, to be honest with you. So it might be broken down actually into 3 reads once again. But I'll see you next time. Have a good day.